Hello, podcast listeners. On October 28th, 1999, just before 9 p.m., multiple shots rang out in the parking lot of Pleasant Valley Methodist Church as choir practice was letting out for the night. Members of the choir would run to the Jeep of one of their fellow church members to find her fatally wounded, lying in a pool of blood, and a light-colored car speeding away. This is a story of love, betrayal, corruption, political scandal, and at least one murder. I'm Amanda, and you're listening to New York's Dark Side. Welcome to November. I feel like this year is just flying right on by, and it's really crazy. I am not at all ready for the holidays. Today is November 5th on the day this releases, so it also happens to be my husband's birthday. So happy birthday to my love, Jared. It's also National Donut Day, and that just sounds amazing. So I'm going to have to go get me some donuts. This week, I have a true crime story for you. This is a case out of Poughkeepsie, New York. I came across this one by chance. I was looking into something else while I was researching for the episode that I released last week. And somehow I ended up with an article relating to this case in the mix. I'm not sure how that happened, but I'm glad it worked out because it's perfect for the vibe that I am going with for the episodes in November, because it's got an element of dirty politicians that plays into this case as well. Just one more thing before I get started. I do want to give a brief trigger warning that there is some discussion of suicide and attempted suicide in this case. I know I personally struggle with that topic. I'll give trigger warnings as we get closer to those portions of the story so that anyone who wants to can skip ahead. But if you decide that this episode is not for you, that's totally okay too. I hope you will join me next week for another episode. Today, we're discussing the case of Susan Fassett. I heard about this case quite a while ago on a Forensic Files episode, but I found out so much more than what was covered in that episode when I dove into the research for this case. We're going to jump right into it. Susan Elizabeth Tabor was born in Dowling, New York on February 26, 1951. I had never heard of Dowling, so I looked it up. It's a village in Dutchess County, about a half hour from the Connecticut border or so, which I thought was interesting. It's not too far from the Bedford, New York area, which we just talked about in the last episode with the colonial witch trials. So plug for that. I like the picture of their welcome sign that's on the Dowling Village website as a quote that says, "Where history lives on as the future unfolds." And I know I am a nerd, but that just really resonated with me because we talk about that kind of stuff a lot. Anyway, Susan was born to William and Helen Tabor, and she grew up on a farm. She was very close with her father growing up, but she dreamed of being a teacher like her mother. Her mother actually taught in a one-room schoolhouse. However, growing up in the 1960s and 70s, she knew that it was not a good time to be a teacher. There were far more teachers than there were jobs. The odds might not be in her favor. So instead, she found a desk job and ended up moving to Poughkeepsie, New York. Oh, twisted fate. It makes me sad, really, to think about how one decision impacts your life so heavy. And that's incredibly deep. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But one day in the mid-1970s, she met a man named Jeff in a bar. And over time, they would fall in love and got married. Jeff worked as a police officer in Poughkeepsie. And he was actually a bit of an opposite personality-wise to Susan. Where Susan was very personable, she was social, she liked to go out and travel and go to different events and games. Jeff was more introverted and more of a homebody. They would have two sons named Jason and Christopher. And Susan worked her way up to being the personnel coordinator for the town of Poughkeepsie. She was also very involved in the church and was part of the church choir. I wish I could say that things were perfect in the home, but just like most homes, they weren't. And I wouldn't be telling you about this case if they had been. Susan, despite being very social and more extroverted, she also was not one to really share her feelings and concerns or problems. She felt like she didn't want to burden anyone, so she just kept them to herself. When Susan and the boys would go to do things like go to the city to go shopping or to a ball game or on other trips and errands, Jeff preferred to stay home, which likely really bothered Susan. She didn't talk about these concerns with Jeff, and Jeff would say later that he likely didn't help matters with their marriage because his behavior could seem like he was emotionally unavailable to Susan and the boys. There is one person who likely picked up on this tension in the marriage and unfortunately took advantage of the situation to insert himself into Susan's life. Susan would end up starting an affair with a man that she met at work named Fred Andros. And this would prove to be Susan's undoing. Fred Andros was said to be basically an asshole. He was arrogant, a womanizer, very manipulative and controlling. He was condescending. He was described by the town hall employees as not being able to speak with women without making disgusting sexual comments or trying to make a pass at them. Just super gross, nasty behavior. He would even go so far as to have city workers come to do work on his own home during their paid time. So he was using taxpayer dollars to benefit himself to get shit done at his house. He had also illegally hooked up his house to the water, so he was showering his dirty ass in free water. He was a short man, standing about 5'7", and he wore heeled cowboy boots to give himself a little more height. Along with that, he wore outdated Western shirts and jeans, and he kept his hair slicked back, like quite the picture. I've got pictures on the website. Fred Andros grew up in Poughkeepsie and had gotten into trouble during his teens for petty crimes like burglary. He dreamed of making it big as like a mafia-type badass, and from the sounds of it, he was trying very, very hard to put on this persona. People at Town Hall had a saying, "You don't say no to Freddie, you just don't." Fred was married. He was on his fourth wife, Diane, when he met Susan. He had multiple children with different partners. Besides the multiple failed marriages, Fred basically kept 2 mistresses at any given time. He had multiple one-night stands, and he frequently picked up women who engaged in sex work. One source said he spent hundreds of dollars a day on sex workers. He gives me the having more is just not enough vibe. I don't know if that makes any sense, really. I mean, he's got a wife, he's got multiple girlfriends, he's got even more side pieces, and he's also picking up sex workers. And even that's still not enough for him. Just ew. Ew, Fred. Susan and Fred would continue their affair for about 3 years before Jeff became aware of it. Jeff had gotten the feeling the summer of 1999 that something was going on with Susan. From the source material, it seemed like people at Town Hall were well aware that Susan and Fred had something going on for quite a while. Jeff worked a town over and was said to be the last to know about the affair. He ended up installing a recording device on the home telephone, and he recorded a telephone conversation between Susan and Fred that would let him know the truth of what was going on. And he would confront Susan with this information. This confrontation would take place a few days before their 24th wedding anniversary. Obviously, this was a very difficult time for Susan and Jeff. Their marriage was already struggling, and this about broke it completely. Jeff would have Susan move into the in-law apartment of their home, so they were sleeping in separate areas, but they continued to live in the same home. However, even though they had already sat their sons down and told them that things were over, Susan wasn't quite ready for the marriage to end. After a few weeks of living in the home in very tense circumstances, one night she climbed into bed with Jeff, told him that she would end the affair and that she wanted to work things out. And Jeff agreed. She handed over the cell phone and pager that Jeff had given her to contact him with, and they both took some time off of work. They ended up purchasing new wedding bands as a fresh start, and they spent the week before her murder working on different projects around the home, spending time together, working on repairing things around the house and with their broken relationship. On October 28th, 1999, it was like any other day. Susan had to work that day, so she went to town hall and was doing her thing. Jeff went to the jewelry store and he picked up his new wedding band. And he stopped by town hall to see Susan and show her the ring, and they chatted for a few minutes. Later that day, Susan would come home. She had dinner with the family, and she went to church for choir practice. There was one odd occurrence during dinner. Jeff was convinced that he saw a shadowy figure out in the lawn looking through the windows. Susan didn't see it. She told him that it wasn't there, but he was sure. He actually got up and he went outside. And there was someone hurrying down the street in a black hoodie to a light-colored sedan. Jeff and Susan, they kind of shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone was just lost. Susan would leave to go to choir practice. Jeff stayed home watching television with their 2 teenage sons. But around 7:30 p.m., he would tell them that he was going to go stop by the police station to pick up his paycheck. Choir practice that night ended between 8:30 and 8:45 p.m. Susan said goodbye to her fellow church members and walked across the street to where she had parked her car and got in. As she was getting settled into the car, the first of a total of 6 shots would ring out. Some of her fellow church members were still around, and at first they thought maybe the shots were someone letting off firecrackers, but then they saw the light-colored sedan speeding away, and Susan was on the ground outside of her Jeep in a pool of blood. They would make a frantic call to emergency services, but unfortunately, Susan had been fatally wounded. Jeff returned home. He resumed watching television with his sons. The police immediately suspected that Jeff had something to do with his wife's fatal shooting. It's always the husband, right? It's always the spouse. And this was seemingly confirmed when they were told that his car had been seen in the area. So they went to the Fassett's house and surrounded it with all their lights on, and apparently didn't approach the door or try to contact Jeff by phone. They just surrounded the house and sat there, guns drawn. Jeff saw that the police were out there and was confused. So being a police officer, he called to headquarters and asked what was going on, which I think is reasonable. If there's something going on in a neighboring house where you shouldn't be out and should be sheltering in place, it's probably best to do so. He would say that when he called, no one would give him a clear answer. They didn't tell him anything had happened with Susan. Nothing. Looking back out the window, though, he could see the officers surrounding his house with their guns drawn. So now he's starting to get concerned. His sons are also in the home, and it looks like his department has turned on him and are surrounding his house. I don't know what I would do in this situation at all. Jason Fassett, one of the sons, was also trying to call around to find out what was going on. And he called the church and spoke with somebody. And this is when they found out that Susan had been shot. They didn't know she was dead. But this is just horrific. He tells his dad, and his dad's next steps are to turn the lights out and continue to wait things out. Obviously, he knows that maybe they're suspecting him at this point. Police, however, were surrounding the house with the belief that he had killed Susan, and they knew he had guns, and now they are taking this as Jeff barricading himself in. Which, again, I guess I don't know how much sense it makes to me, because he called and he asked what was going on. And if he was barricading himself in, why would he call to find out what was going on from the police? Like, I get guilty people try to play innocent or whatever, but if they truly told him nothing as to what was going on, I don't know. Ultimately, what happened was there was some poor communication, and the license plate that had been given as Jeff's car was actually Susan's Jeep's license plate number, which was at the scene because she had driven it to choir practice. And that's what caused this whole kerfluffle. After about 2 hours with nothing changing, Jeff decided that he and his sons were going to have to go out of the house and confront the situation head on. So they exited their home with their hands up, and they were immediately thrown to the ground in handcuffs. I'm not sure why they felt the need to put Jason and Christopher in handcuffs, but they did. Jeff is questioned, of course. Unfortunately, he didn't really have an alibi because he had left the house for a period of time to pick up his paycheck in the near vicinity of when this happened. However, he was super cooperative. He took and passed a polygraph. He told them he would do whatever they needed, answer whatever they wanted, but when they were done looking at him, they needed to look at Fred Andros. The night of the murder, Fred Andros was home. He was having dinner with his wife, as well as the Birds, who were a couple that Fred was friends with through the local model airplane group. Mr. Bird also just so happened to be a former police officer. Fred appeared to have a very solid alibi, but things might not be exactly as they appeared. Fred Andros had actually been in quite a lot of trouble recently. I mentioned earlier that Fred and Susan had met at town hall because they both worked there. That's where Fred's trouble comes into play because Fred did the town dirty. He was working as the town superintendent of the water board, and he, along with a couple of other high-ranking people in the town, had been investigated by the FBI in a case of corruption and racketeering. In fact, Fred had to resign from his position back in May because he had pled guilty to one count of conspiracy, helping extort over $100,000 from people and businesses by taking cash bribes for water permits or refusing to give people water permits unless they paid him for them. The other two names I saw involved in the scheme were William Paroli Sr. and Basil, who went by Bill Raucci. Paroli was a retired police detective who in the 1970s became active in politics, and he would work his way up to becoming the chairman of the Dutchess County Republican Party, and he worked as the Republican Party elections commissioner. He was said to be the one spearheading this corruption, taking money from bribes from the contractors to enrich himself and other members involved, and for the Republican Party. Bill Raucci was the former town of Poughkeepsie tax assessor, and actually in 1997, after being confronted by the FBI investigating this case, he was found deceased in the Hudson River. This was later labeled as a suicide, but many people were concerned that there was more likely foul play involved. In fact, investigators would later say that Fred likely was the one to start that rumor to help inflate his status as a badass and was telling people that he and someone else involved in the conspiracy had taken out a key witness. It doesn't look like anything further ever came from those concerns. Again, they labeled it as a suicide, but I don't think the FBI really knew what they were getting into when they started investigating the town corruption concerns, which we'll get into a little bit. When Susan's body was taken for autopsy, they would find that she had been struck by 5 bullets. They would also find evidence that she had had sexual relations with someone within the last 48 hours. When they discussed this with Jeff, he was shocked to hear it, telling investigators that they hadn't had intercourse in the last couple of days. He would submit a DNA sample, which would show to not be a match. Knowing that Susan had the previous affair with Fred Andros, even though she had supposedly ended it, investigators would talk to Fred. Fred would tell him that the affair was over and actually had been for about 1.5 years, which was a lie. He would also try to say that even if it hadn't been over, he was impotent, so he wasn't able to have intercourse, and that his affair with Susan hadn't been sexual. And he would refuse to, of course, give a DNA sample when asked. Investigators were obviously not going to take his word for that. Word around town was Fred was a real womanizer, like I said, and he continued to pick up women in the sex trade while this investigation was going on. Some of these women would be questioned and would tell investigators that he most certainly wasn't impotent. He was just a liar. They didn't have enough evidence at this point to get a warrant for his DNA, though, because he had that airtight alibi. Investigators would have to get a little crafty to get some additional evidence to move this case forward. They decided to try to set a trap. One of the investigators on the case would reach out to Fred Andros, telling him that he needed to speak with him again, and invited him to lunch. They sat in the car and spoke, but Fred initially didn't eat anything of the lunch he had ordered. He was likely a little bit suspicious of what was going on since they had already asked him for a sample of DNA, which he had refused. The investigator just kept talking to him and slowly kept turning the heat on higher and higher and higher until Fred finally broke and took a drink out of the soda that had been purchased for him. And he left that cup in the car when he exited the vehicle. So that was how they got his DNA. This would prove to be a match. Fred would be questioned again, and this time he had all kinds of stories for investigators. He first, of course, accused Jeff of killing Susan for being the jealous husband, but that had already been ruled out. He also tried to pin Susan's murder on Paroli, the head of the Republican committee, because Fred had actually accepted a plea deal and was one of the key witnesses against Paroli. So, I mean, that could give some motive there, but investigators didn't buy that one. He even tried to pin the murder on his wife, Diane, who had been with him at the dinner that night with the Birds, stating that she might have slipped out of the house while Fred and Mr. Bird were out in the garage working on model airplanes. Again, investigators did not buy this story. So finally, trapped in a corner, Fred pulled out what he thought would be his ace in the hole. He told the investigators that, quote, maybe Susan was killed by a lesbian lover, end quote. And this is where Dawn Silvernail officially enters the picture. Dawn Silvernail was Fred Andros' other mistress. They had actually been in a relationship for about 20 years at this point. Dawn and Fred had met over CB radio. She had the handle Delta Dawn, and Fred had the handle Neptune, which is random. Anyway, they became friends, chatting over CB radio for a while before finally meeting in a dive bar. Dawn actually would moonlight in local bars and nightclubs as a country western singer, and by day she worked with individuals with developmental disabilities. Many of her coworkers described her as an angel. She had grown up fishing, hunting, and doing the like. She was married to her second husband when she started the affair with Fred, and things were not going great. Fred clearly has a knack for picking up on this sort of thing with women and taking real advantage of it to insert himself into the situation. Dawn was said to be a very open-minded lover, and she would let him do things that his wife wasn't into, like play with sex toys and the like. She would later say that she really wasn't into sex in general, but she let men do whatever they wanted to her, which is just sad. I'm not going to go down that whole rabbit hole, but anything between partners should be consensual and focused on making sure all parties are having a pleasurable experience. Thank you. That's all I'm going to say on that matter. Throughout the years, Fred would lend Dawn money, quite a substantial amount overall, amounting to over $15,000. But nothing in life is free, and Dawn would find out that the hard way. Fred began to call in those favors in many different ways. He would actually traffic her to his friends and coworkers, forcing her to have sexual relations with them. He would use her as a mule, having her deliver mysterious envelopes and packages around town, which was probably extorted money from the contractors that were being fucked over. He would even pay her to have a few three-ways with Susan, claiming that Susan wanted to experiment in that way. But Dawn could tell during the first of these encounters that Susan was clearly uncomfortable and needed to be coaxed by Fred to participate. Dawn was paid $350 for the first encounter and would be paid a total of about $1,200 for the 5 or 6 encounters that were had. The last encounter took place in one of the water pump stations on a blanket, and Fred had the nerve to video record the tryst, which investigators would find when they searched his house. He was just a fucking gross ass man. And I'm pretty sure the women knew he was recording. Technology wasn't what it is now, so I hope they knew. But even so, he probably didn't have good intentions for what he planned to do with that tape. He was very good at controlling everyone and coming up with ways to blackmail people to get what he wanted. He would tell investigators that Dawn had fired 6 shots with her .45 caliber revolver, and these were not details that police had released to the public, so they knew this time they had something. When police came to question Dawn for the first time, she was very cooperative. She told them she didn't know Susan. They told her that they were questioning and searching all homes with registered .45 caliber revolvers, which she admitted she had. It was on the background check when they did it, and she did hand it over to them. When the forensics lab examined the gun, they would find that it had been purposely tampered with, which was concerning. They ended up questioning some neighbors who would tell them that Dawn and her husband would frequently shoot their guns out in the backyard at trees to, do target practice. So investigators would go to the backyard and search, and they did find some bullets that would ultimately match the ones pulled from Susan at autopsy. When police would question Dawn again, she would end up confessing. The story that she told was that she and Fred had been together a long time, and that he had come to her concerned that when Susan ended things with their affair, she was going to turn on him to investigators looking into the conspiracy case. He was afraid that she had dirt on him and that she needed to go. So he asked if Dawn knew anyone that could take care of Susan. She told him no, that she didn't. So he told her that she would need to do it, and if she did, he would absolve all her past debt to him. She was not into that plan at first at all. So one day he called her over to his home when his wife Diane was away. When Dawn got there, she noticed that there were a bunch of pictures laid out on the dining room table. And when she looked closer at them, she saw that they were surveillance photos of her family. There were a few of her son at the loading dock of the factory where he was employed, just smoking a cigarette, taking a break, not at all knowing that he was being surveilled. Fred would tell Dawn that she needed to take care of Susan before someone took care of her problems, indicating her son. He told her it would be a shame if someone took him out in a drive-by. This is what convinced Dawn to agree, because she was afraid of Fred. She'd heard rumors that he had helped take someone out, so she was afraid for her family. Dawn, of course, was arrested, but investigators weren't done yet. They knew that they also needed to get Fred, and this is where the challenge was. He had that airtight alibi. Dawn was willing to testify against Fred, which was good, but that wasn't enough. New York has a law that prevents a conviction of an individual based solely on the testimony of a co-conspirator, which is a complete opposite of the situation in Arizona with the Don Bowles homicide. If you haven't listened to those 2 episodes, check them out because that's a messed up, dirty fucking situation. Thank you, New York, for doing something right, because I can't imagine being convicted on a confession of someone who's known to be a damn dirty liar. Harvey Adamson. Okay. The lead investigator, Tom Martin, would end up coming up with a plan. He had all the data from the phones and pagers of Susan, Fred, and Dawn. Dawn told investigators that she had never been in contact with Susan. The only times that they had spent together had been set up by Fred. So this might be the evidence they needed to implicate him in the murder. They just needed to prove it. The first issue was that they had thousands and thousands of phone, email, pager, and cell phone communications between the 3 that needed to be sorted to try to get a clear answer as to what was going on. Tom Martin, the lead investigator, went to the National Law Enforcement and Corrections Technology Center Northeast. They had a law enforcement analysis facility, or LEAF, that was able to help analyze the information they had. So they used a technology called Web-Enabled Timeline Analysis System, or WebTAS, that built them a timeline of events showing who contacted who and from where, all on a map. And this showed conclusively that Dawn had no contact with Susan, but Fred had been in contact with both women multiple times a day leading up to the murder. In fact, he had just gotten off the phone with Susan right before Jeff showed up with the new wedding band. Dawn and Fred had been in communications multiple times leading up to the murder to plan everything out. They had multiple planning sessions. The week prior to Susan's murder, Dawn had actually followed Susan to a jazzercise class, but backed out at the last minute before killing Susan because she was concerned that there would be too many witnesses. On October 28, 1999, Dawn and Fred met at a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot where he gave her a pair of fake license plates. Dawn had been the shadowy figure that Jeff had noticed that evening when the family was having dinner. Later in the evening, she parked next to Susan's car while Susan was at choir practice, pulled her seat all the way back, and hunkered down in her car waiting for Susan to come back out. Susan got into her car just before 9 p.m., and as Dawn watched her shut the door and reach for her seatbelt to buckle herself in, Dawn raised a gun and fired the first 2 shots. Susan tried to get out of her car to get away, and Dawn would empty out the rest of the revolver, then speed away. She stopped at a gas station and made a page to Fred to let him know it was done, and then she dumped the license plates and the gun behind a prearranged location. There was a tree that they had decided that she was going to leave the evidence in, and Fred would later go retrieve it. The day after Dawn confessed, investigators would go to collect Fred Andros. They approached his house and knocked on the door. Fred's teenage son would let them in, telling them that Fred was around somewhere in the house, so they split up to search. And this is where I'm going to give that trigger warning that I mentioned earlier, so this is your cue to skip ahead. I'll give you a second to do so. One of the investigators approached the attic and noted that the door was cracked open. He called out to Fred, telling him that he was coming in, and as he did so, he heard a single gunshot. Rushing in, he found Fred Andros on the floor of the attic with a handgun beside him. But Fred was still alive. He had attempted to end his life by placing the muzzle of the gun under his chin, but the bullet deflected off his nasal bones and came out of his forehead. He would spend a month at Westchester Medical Center and be left with permanent scarring, but he would live to face trial. On January 6, 2000, a grand jury would indict both Fred Andros and Dawn Silvernail for the murder of Susan Fassett. Fred was sent to Dutchess County Jail to await trial. Susan had been at Dutchess County until Fred arrived there from the hospital, but was moved to Putnam County Jail to ensure they had no contact. On February 17, 2000, Fred Andros would enter a plea of not guilty. Dawn pled guilty to one count of second-degree murder on March 27th and agreed to testify against Fred in exchange for leniency. On April 26th, prosecutors would announce a new charge of second-degree conspiracy against Fred Andros. On June 23rd, he was sentenced by a federal court judge to 33 months for his role in the town corruption case. The charge of second-degree murder against Fred Andros really fucked up the federal investigators' case, since he was supposed to be their lead witness against Paroli Sr. However, now he was not a favorable witness in that case with these additional charges against him. His murder trial would start in January of 2001, and he was ultimately found guilty. He would be sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, which was to run consecutively with his conspiracy sentence. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility and died 2 years later on November 28, 2002 of an apparent heart attack. Dawn Silvernail was sentenced to 18 years to life for her role in the murder of Susan Fassett. She was denied parole and would also die in prison in April of 2020. She would give multiple interviews after the conviction, appearing remorseful for her role in ending the life of a wife and mother. But there are some anonymous sources close to her that would say that there was always something about Dawn that made them think that maybe she was exhilarated at the thought of potentially ending someone's life, and maybe that's why she agreed to it. It does make me wonder a bit, if Fred Andros could threaten to have someone take out her son, why was he using that as a reason to get her to take out Susan? I don't know. And that, my friends, was the tragic tale of a love triangle filled with betrayal, corruption, manipulation, and just one giant asshole behind it all. I need a shower after this one. Head on over to our social pages where we can continue the conversation. Let me know what you think of this case. Make sure you're following the show on your podcast platform of choice to be the first to know when new episodes drop. And I just want to give you all a quick shout out. It's been amazing to see the show continuing to grow over the last couple of weeks. I'm working on some great new content to bring you, so please continue to share with your friends, your coworkers, your gym buddies, the weird cousins that you only see around the holidays. I'm working on adding some fun new options to the Patreon, which I'm hoping to launch soon, so keep an eye out for announcements around that. All of the sources for this show are linked in the show notes and on our webpage. And I just want to put a quick plug in if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health or considering self-harm, please don't. Reach out to someone. Use the emergency crisis line 988. You matter, and the world is better with you in it. I think that wraps up all of the business. I hope everyone has a wonderful week ahead, and most of all, I hope you stay curious.